Good evening, welcome. I'm sorry there's been problems about accommodation. As announced, there will be a question and answer session after the lecture that will last probably a little over an hour, but we'll try and keep it to exactly an hour. There are papers on every chair so that questions can be asked in writing. Apart from making the questions generally more efficient and perhaps shorter, it also means that the overflow room downstairs, who have to just simply watch us on the screen, can join in the process through asking their questions, which we will also take. We're all pressed men on this planet. None of us is a volunteer. And once here, we choose to live our lives according to rules that we make for ourselves. And often it seems to me, spend rather more time on what happens when people break the rules, the laws, than on finding ways of getting people to comply with the rules in the first place. And I only mention that because it's perhaps a theme of this, my last year as Gresham Professor of Law. It's obviously relevant in the forthcoming lectures on sex and on prison and maybe on human rights, but maybe it's also relevant on these two lectures about the Israel-Gaza conflict, this one and the next one, which sometimes generate high emotion, but which needn't, and which can be conducted, I'm quite sure, calmly today. You may recall that last year in the summer, 51 days, there was a conflict between Israel and Gaza. It was given the name Protective Edge, and in the course of it, 66 Israeli military, 6 Israeli civilians, 2,130 Gazans, of whom 1,473 were identified as civilians, and of those 500 were children. There's a background to this in that there has been since 2006 a number of conflicts. Let me go back a bit. It seems to be not there, never mind. Something gone wrong, but don't worry, I'll leave it there. There have been a number of earlier conflicts between 2006 and 2012, two of which will feature. One's called Operation Cast Lead in 2008, and one's called Pillar of Defense in 2012. And what's interesting about these conflicts is that they come under different governments with political leaders of different persuasions. While this last year's conflict was going on, I was asked to prepare a presentation about whether war crimes were committed by Israel in Gaza. And I said, well, certainly not on my own. It's a multidisciplinary task. There's no way you can do that on your own. I said, what's more, if I put together a multidisciplinary team, they're unlikely to be able to pronounce on the final question of whether a war crime was committed. We wouldn't have anything like enough information or detailed information. On the other hand, it would be possible, perhaps, to explore the issue of how one should approach whether war crimes are committed. Itself a very important question, given the frequency with which politicians and commentators use the term, and it's a term, therefore, which the ordinary person has to be able to understand, because the presentation I was asked to prepare was for a lay audience, not for a specialist audience. And so a team was put together of me, General Nick Parker, who's going to give the other half of this lecture, Professor Avi Schlein, who's going to be present at the panel afterwards, Dr. Nevenka Tromp, who's also going to be present there, and Rodney Dixon, a lawyer. So we put together a team. 4 of us were newcomers to it, and so we tried to form our opinions independently of the well-known and strong views held by Professor Schlein. 3 of us managed to get into Gaza in November, which was utterly illuminating for all of us. Now, one of the advantages of having Professor Schlein with us was that he can help us with the history. And history of a conflict is always going to be relevant to some extent or another. You need to know how the conflict originated, but more important, you need to know what the history is if you find yourself examining motivation in people which may or may not assist in due course with whether they should be investigated for war crimes. There's a very, very short potted history of the professor. But remember this as well. History can only have a limited, or at least a confined value. Compare it with the fistfight between two chaps, one of whom has gravely wronged the other for years. But once the fight's underway, that doesn't give him an excuse to murder the other man. Not at all. If he does, the law will be on him. And it's much the same with states that find themselves in armed conflicts, which is what we're dealing with here. In the printed handout, you'll get more than you get from the lectern and from the table here this evening. As to Zionism, many of you will know a lot about it, and probably if I just touch on a few points by way of reminder, it will be appropriate and worthwhile. The concept, I suppose, began at the end of the 19th century with different strands. In 1917, the British lent their support to it with the Balfour Declaration, a letter from the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild explaining the British view, highlighted, not unimportant, it being clearly understood, despite the favour of the establishment for the creation of a homeland for the Jewish, a natural home for the Jewish people, it was clearly understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And I think, here you are, there's the original. In 1922, Britain was given a mandate to deal with or look after Palestine by the League of Nations. And at that stage, that was the territory, the pale-coloured territory, that it ran between 1922 and 1948. Within that time, as Professor Schleim explains, one strand of Zionism was reflected by a man called Zev Jabotinsky. Now, he was a chap who'd actually fought for the British in the First World War very bravely and been decorated, I think, 3 times. But he expressed the view that the only way to realize the Zionist project of an independent Jewish state in Palestine was unilaterally and by military force. A Jewish state could only be built around an iron wall of Jewish military power. The Arabs would hit their heads against the wall, but eventually they would despair and give up any hope. And here's a quotation of his: a voluntary agreement between us Jews and the Arabs is inconceivable. Every indigenous people will resist settlers, and so on. And Professor Schleim says, well, that philosophy has actually been reflected in what's actually happened on the ground and has been consistent through governments of different persuasion right up, effectively, until the present day. It's the dominant strategy under successive Israeli prime ministers from David Ben-Gurion to Benjamin Netanyahu. In 1939, Great Britain may have changed its position slightly in relation, or significantly in relation, to the formation of a Jewish state. In 1947, there was a United Nations proposal for a distribution of territory between, as you can see, the hashed colour and the solid colour, which was much more even than anything that's been achieved since. And it may be that it's fair or at least appropriate to say, and there are some further plans in the handout, that the Arabs have lost territory really ever since that proposal. And what happened was that there were wars, and there was a declaration of independence by Israel in 1948, and eventually, which was immediately acknowledged by the United States of America. And this is the armistice agreement following some further battles in 1949, and if you have any doubt about how small Gaza is, it's that little bit there. And that was the Gaza Strip that was administered by Egypt for some 19 years until the well-known 6-day 1967 war, meant that Israel took over not only the Gaza, but also the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank, which it then ruled for a further number of years. And as long as that occupation was underway, the prospects of a two-state solution were simply never considered. And it may be appropriate to think of the philosophy of a greater Israel having its part at this time. There was then, as some of you will probably also remember, the Oslo peace process. We come right up to date with, not right up to date, we come further forward with Yitzhak Rabin's willingness to negotiate, the first Israeli prime minister who was willing to do that. The peace process was going to be gradual. It wasn't going to try and deal with final permanent status problems until a much later stage, but it was a move in a direction of negotiated settlement. In 1995, he was assassinated by a Jewish fanatic at a peace rally, and then in 2000 and between 2000 and 2001, the Camp David summit failed. And we then bring ourselves much more nearly up to date. Professor Schleem maintains that Benjamin Netanyahu's vision of Israel corresponds to the revisionist ideas, because he now becomes a principal feature of the modern politics of Israel, becomes that the revisionist Zionist ideals and the greater Israeli ideology, where Israel seeks to have the whole territory from the river to the west, the entire land of Israel, has persisted. And Netanyahu was elected prime minister, was elected leader of Likud in March 1993, and he published a book called A Place Among the Nations, Israel and the World. And the reason we mention, or I mention, the Jabotinsky document of 1923 is because it can be seen that this book may be seen as inspired by that 1923 philosophy and approach. And indeed, Netanyahu's father, who was a historian, had been an advisor to Jabotinsky, and in his book, Netanyahu has nothing really positive to say about the Arabs and nothing to acknowledge their right to national self-determination, no acknowledgement of the possibility of compromise. That's part of the history. I repeat, history is relevant, interesting and important, but ultimately it has to be contained for reasons which will come when, of course, we consider the law. The comings and goings of prime ministers with Netanyahu leaving office and then coming back bring us to 2005, when a government of his party, the Likud party, headed by Ariel Sharon, effected a unilateral Israeli pullout from Gaza. And that was 8,000 settlers being withdrawn, their houses being destroyed as they left, but at the same time, 12,000 additional settlers were being put in the West Bank territories, which was one of the problems that you'll all be familiar with. Now, at this stage, it may be, as Professor describes it, that Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, had conducted an effective campaign to drive the Israelis out of Gaza. And this withdrawal was in some senses a victory for Hamas, the political organization, and the humiliation, or they would say terrorist organization, and a humiliation for the Israeli Defense Forces, notwithstanding the 12,000 additional settlers who were moved in a controversial way to territory by Israel. In 2006, elections in the West Bank unexpectedly led to Hamas winning a decisive victory over Fatah, the West Bank association or organization or political group, and that success was problematic because it was necessary to maintain, maybe for Israel, assisted by America, separation between these two different political units. And it's one of the disturbing features that papers released called the Palestine Papers, a cache of 1,600 diplomatic documents released, I think, leaked, I suppose is the word, through Al Jazeera, revealed how Israel and America armed and trained the security forces of Mahmoud Abbas, of Fatah, with the aim of overthrowing Hamas. And even when you got developing political events which might lead to compromise, to find the great powers engaging in this way with perhaps the ultimate consequences that we've seen is truly disturbing. The next thing that happens, I suppose, of significance, and which you may remember, is that in 2007, Israel imposed a complete blockade on Gaza. That's from the air, from the sea, with ever-reducing amount of water in which they could fish, and a blockade over land. Then from 2008, you have 4 major attacks on Gaza by Israel, military incursions reflecting the new government policy of containment. And it's been said by many, this created an open prison, enforced then by the government of Ehud Olmert, quite as much as by the later government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And this was keeping the West Bank and Gaza, Fatah and Hamas separate under the divide and rule principle. On the 4th of November 2008, with outgoing rockets from Gaza, and you'll know that Gaza has had a history of rockets going out, rockets that can't be that well directed or controlled or targeted. Rockets going out were at a low rate. And it was at that stage that the Israeli Defense Force launched an attack within Gaza territory on the pretext or on the reasoning of a tunnel that was being built within the territory of Gaza, which was not be a breach of the then existing ceasefire. And was it an excuse? Was it used as a reason, this tunnel, for Israel to mount an attack? On the 27th of December of 2008, a massive air attack on Gaza was launched, followed by a ground invasion on the 3rd of January of 2009, the stated aims being to stop rocket and mortar fire and to prevent the smuggling of weapons. You'll also know of the pattern of underground tunnels underneath Gaza, going to Egypt, going into Israel, the purpose being said to be sometimes military, but of course the purpose also being, certainly following the blockade, to enable trade to pass, to be effective between these two countries in Gaza, when the blockade would otherwise have rendered it impossible. This operation, Cast-led, was the subject of a very extensive and detailed report set up by the United Nations under Richard Goldstone's chairmanship. It's worth reading, or reading the summary of it. It's extremely critical of Israel. It makes all sorts of findings, technical, about crimes committed by Israel against the occupants of Gaza in the course of that attack, where 1,400 Gazans were killed, including more than 300 children, where factories and small industries and so on were destroyed. Sometime later, it is said, after great pressure was put on him by America and by Israel, Goldstone wrote an op-ed which maybe moderated his view, but it didn't affect the opinion of those who sat on the commission with him, not at all. What's happened, of course, is that to some extent this emphatic report has become the subject of concern, not the contents of the report. And so an argument is left, why did Goldstone do this? Not what did the report say, what did the report show? That report recommended reference to the International Criminal Court. And those of you who follow these things will know that there has been no such reference on the basis of that report, although since the Palestinian Authority has signed up to the ICC since, there has now been a form of reference to the court in respect of the operation that happened last year, the operation with which we are more immediately concerned. Looking at the history until this point, Professor Schleim concludes that violence was the defining characteristic of the Netanyahu government's approach to Hamas. Like its predecessors, it shunned diplomacy and relied heavily on brute military force. And he will say, and says in his books, and you can find a summary of it in the paper, that he missed opportunity after opportunity. And then in November 2012, it ordered an extrajudicial assassination. The government of Israel ordered an extrajudicial assassination of Ahmed Yabari, the chief of Hamas's military wing, at the very moment he was reviewing a proposal for a permanent truce in substitution of the provisional truce that was then in place. And the timing of this assassination may be a matter of some concern, suggesting an attempt to preempt the threat for Israel of a diplomatic solution. In any event, Israel broke the informal ceasefire to operate that second named event, pillar of defense that I referred to right at the beginning. And in 8 days of intense aerial bombardment, 132 Palestinians were killed. And that ended with a ceasefire brokered by Egypt on certain terms, including that there would be a cessation of hostilities and the border crossings would now be open. What happened with that is described in the paperwork that you can pick up when you leave by the International Crisis Group, an independent group, and its unhappy realities. This brings us then to the Operation Protective Edge. And in April 2014, a breakthrough happened between Fatah and Hamas. They formed a unity government. The unity government produced an accord between Fatah and Hamas, remarkably moderate in its composition. It was a government of Fatah officials only and technocrats and independents without a single Hamas-affiliated member, so that it couldn't be suggested that this was a government by terrorists. The unity government accepted 3 conditions of the United States, Russia, UN, and Europe for receiving Western aid: recognition of Israel, respect for past agreements, and renunciation of violence. This form of unity may have been rather concerning for Israel, and hostile propaganda followed. And then there was a military assault on the 8th of July of 2014. Was this really a response to the terrible murder of the young Jewish boys, or was this something that was waited for as a justification that could lead to the onslaught that was to follow? These are the issues that, for example, a court dealing with this matter would have to decide in due course. But it's true that there were 3 Israeli teenagers who were abducted and killed. Netanyahu stated that Hamas was responsible. There may be no direct evidence of that, and it may still not be established one way or another whether they were responsible. There was a period of time when knowledge that they'd been killed was kept from the public. The public were whipped up, and then maybe public enthusiasm for what was to follow was whipped up, and that led to Operation Protective Edge, about which I'll say something in a little bit of detail, and then General Parker will have a lot more to say. Was there, by this time, and with that rapid survey of the history to remind you of what you will have read in many places and on many years, was there an urge to punish the people of Gaza for electing Hamas and for continuing to support it in defiance of Israel's repeated warnings? Related to this was the irresistible urge, it may be, of Israel to display its raw military power, all consistent with the Jabotinsky principle to which we've already referred. The overriding aim was to defeat the struggle for Palestinian independence and to maintain, really, the colonial status quo, and to preserve Israel's position as, really, an imperial overlord. The attack was presented by Israel as an act of self-defense in response to Hamas rockets against its civilian population, and these rockets may themselves have been a response to the violent crackdown. Professor Schleim notes the different stated aims of Operation Protective Edge, and that itself may be a matter of indication or of what the true purpose was. Right, come back to Operation Protective Edge in the 52 days of last year in a second. What about the law? Well, Rodney Dixon, who can't be here, is a person of great distinction And although I'm a lawyer, I also turned to him. I thought it was well to have another lawyer deal with all these matters, and he's the real expert. And for a conflict of this kind to be lawful, remember what I said about the two men in a fist fight? Each side's got to obey the law. It must be conducted in accordance with international humanitarian law. And for Israel's attack to be lawful, there needs to be a legitimate military objective. Civilians mustn't be directly targeted, and the operations mustn't be excessive. Now, you will probably all have heard on the television people using the word proportionate or disproportionate, and that's as far as they go, politicians and so on. I'm no complaint about it. But where does that word come from? It doesn't come from the Geneva Conventions or the First Additional Protocol, which deal with many of these matters. It comes, I think, that particular terminology from the International Committee of the Red Cross, whose commentary on these things is regarded as authoritative. And that emerges, I think you'll find. I think something went wrong with my slide somewhere. I'll just have to read it out to you. Yeah, something's got missed, but don't worry. If you go to the Protocol 1, Article 51.5, indiscriminate attacks which are outlawed are attacks which may be expected to cause incidental loss to civilian life, to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Civilian suffering, in short, excessive in relation to direct military advantage anticipated. Or under Article 57, precautions in attack, attacks have to be cancelled or suspended if the incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage. That's the test. And it's not just a test for the overall campaign. It's a test for each individual action. That's why you have attorneys general now sitting in with generals deciding on whether particular targets can or cannot be focused on by bombardment or whatever else it must be. And so this judgment of proportionality has to be made at every level of command. But there's more to it than that. The question of what is proportionate is an objective test. If these things come to court, it won't be the country's perception or the leader's perception of what is proportionate. It will be an objective test made by a court. I saw incidentally that somebody very kindly already sent me one question in writing before we came in, and I just glanced at it. It said, what does the rule of law mean? Well, of course, this is what the rule of law means, and there are governments that are reflecting it, and there may be governments that don't want to know about it, and that's what we'll come to a little bit later. So the law, in a sense, is comparatively straightforward. You cannot target civilians. You've got to act proportionately, and that's what proportionality means. And if you've got no justification for the start of your campaign, the whole thing's unlawful from the beginning, and the state bears responsibility. When the operation was going on, Operation Protective Edge was going on last August, there was an investigator in Gaza, and I was in contact with him, and he selected one or two, or between us we selected one or two incidents to be a focus of particular attention. Let me say at once, if you compare our focus of attention with the focus of attention of another United Nations report produced by Mary Davis, which is also highly critical of Israel, but let's not go into that for the time being, although it's been criticised also for being a bit on the short side as a report, and it suffered again because its presiding member, William Shabas, was forced off the committee or council commission because of alleged bias against Israel. But if you look at her report, Mary Davis's report, you'll find many worse examples than the ones we happen to pick on, or many more serious examples. Examples with 19 members of a single family being killed in one bomb, with none of them apparently having any military reason for being, or there being any military reason for attacking them. But we nevertheless selected 6 examples of things that it's worth thinking about as you decide. Remember, not whether there were war crimes, how do you approach the question of war crimes so that you, the television watcher as well as the parliamentarian and the voter, can understand, or I can understand actually, having been to Gaza a bit, so that we can all understand better how to approach these problems, given that ultimately the responsibility in democracy for what our leaders do is down to us. The first incident was a terrible incident called Boys on the Beach. And it was, 4 boys between the ages of, I think, 9 and 12 were killed. They were playing on the beach in Gaza. Oh, before I come to that, I will just show you a bit about Gaza. That's what it looks like. That was the view from my hotel bedroom, I think. And you look out in the morning and sometimes see people. This is in November, people drilling, military groups drilling. This is the sort of thing that General Parker and I were able to see. I think that's us in the distance. There we are. And at this level of destruction, it's unsurprising that a large number of civilians were killed. Absolutely unsurprising. And there's General Parker with a bit of unexplained ordnance. There he is looking at a map with a chap we were able to talk over, an expert, a geography professor I think he was, who'd mapped all the events happening in Gaza as he heard about them, and he and General Parker were able to match up what the general had picked up from open source material and the man on the ground had been able to show us. And here's Dr. Nevenka Tromp's favourite picture, although she's not in it, she's just off the camera somewhere to the left. Although there's a tree standing, this is a destroyed house and nowhere else to go, so they went back to where their destroyed house was and made us a cup of tea, unasked, and very nice it was too. And of course, in all these terrible conflict zones, you find a remarkable spirit of survival. Boys on the Beach I've dealt with. There was then an incident that I think is covered in the Davis report, but it has to do with something called knock on the roof. The Israeli Defense Force had a pattern of knocking on the roof. You'd send a non-exploding device onto the roof of a house you were going to destroy. It makes a huge noise. And you say that's a warning. Well, it is a warning. People in the house get out. So it makes it a bit surprised why you might do it in the first place. But that's what happens. In this particular case, loud knock on the roof. People in that building went out. The people next door, with nowhere to escape to, thought, we know what's going to come next. And they thought, well, the safest place was to be the ground floor. So they all, middle of the night, went down to the ground floor. The explosion came, completely dropped the house. And the impact went straight out through the ground floor, decapitating one and killing another 8 as they were blown straight through the house onto the road. When I went there, and I'm sure Nick Parker won't mind my saying that, we looked at it for the first time. What was his reaction? Very good hit, he said. And it's very important for people who may have all sorts of tendencies to sympathy to understand that there is a military context which you have to take into account. It was a very good hit because it simply took the house out. The collateral and maybe unforeseen damage, and that's the question, was that the blast would go and kill 9 people in the house next door. And if you read through some of the official reports, the answer is, frankly, if you're going to do a knock on the roof and drop houses like that in highly crowded bits, and Gaza is a very crowded territory, you can expect collateral damage of significant amounts. So that's one. There was a white flag incident. That is somebody coming out and in many languages offering to surrender with a white flag and people behind him. And he was shot. Would that show anything about war crimes? The immediate reaction has to be probably not. It's likely to be a bad apple, a loose cannon, whatever word you like to use, and unless there's a culture of doing that, which you can track up, then the person who did the killing himself, might be culpable of crime, but you can't really infer much more about it than that. Although it's true that in Cast Lead, there were some 7 white flag killings, I think, which are referred to in the Goldstone report. There was then the Al-Wafa Hospital. Now, this is another example of where you need the military view. This hospital, which had been badly attacked and cast lead, was flattened. Mercifully, the people had all got out. There had been warnings, and ultimately warnings by the Red Cross. They'd all got out, long-term patients. And, but the building had been completely flattened. And so you go along there without military expertise and you think that's a terrible thing to do. That can't be justified, must be wrong, must be disproportionate. General Parker took one look at it and said, if that attack was justified, I can quite see why they would want that hospital taken out. It's got the opportunity to fire on the incoming forces. So we have to reconsider our position, those of us who didn't have military expertise. However, when you look at the degree of destruction of the hospital, and when you look at the other medical facilities also damaged or destroyed, different considerations may arise. There was then a school, a UN school, where a very large number of people were using it as a refugee center, and there were children in the playground. A large number of children were killed by an incoming device. And what was said by the Israeli Defense Force was that this was a place of outgoing fire. Well, if it was outgoing fire, it was behind the front line. It would have been a mortar. There would have been a visible base plate, I understand, which would have been seen from the drone that would have been controlling all this thing. And you would have been able to see not just that it was an outgoing mortar, but that it was a place of refugees and it was a place with children. What would be your proper decision, even assuming there was outgoing mortar fire, which was completely challenged by the people within the UN school, marked as a UN school as such? What would be your reaction? Would it be proportionate to take the risk in order to try and get that single mortar? And then the last of the examples, because we wanted to take different things to look at and get our team to look at, was the power station in the middle of nowhere, insofar as anything's in the middle of nowhere in Gaza, given how small it is and how crammed it is. And it was said by the Israeli Defense Forces that this was a mistake for the power station that served 40% of the power requirements of Gaza. But some mistake, because there was in fact a sequence of attacks. The first one was on the day the tank, the daily tank of fuel, which was, I don't remember how many thousands of gallons of fuel, so it floods out on the ground. The next two attacks were on the water and the foam supply that would have dealt with the fire control once a fire had started, and the third one the fourth one, I think, whatever it was, set light to the fuel that was on the ground, and thus destroying the power station. And of course, having control over the resources of Gaza is yet another way of keeping it under control, it is said. So those are the 6 incidents we had a quick look at. I've had a quick look at. We had quite a long look at them at the time. What I'd now do is ask General Parker to pick the story up. Let me just see if there we are. That's him. And I'll speak a bit more later.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'll dwell as little as possible on me. My study of the selected tactics used by the Israeli Defense Force allowed me to draw some conclusions on their legitimacy from a technical military perspective. That's how I'm speaking. Geoffrey's mentioned the 6 incidents. Now, I looked at these to get some specific detail, but my comments were informed by that detail, and I've therefore concentrated now on broader deductions. I've had no access to any secret or classified material, and my account is only informed by open source material and my own experience. Now, it's important when assessing why military actions are taken to examine the facts at a number of levels. There will be a grand strategic narrative which has considerable influence on those who on the behaviours below it. It sets the baseline for the development of a national security strategy, and it works its way into doctrine. It's discussed in colleges. It establishes, in effect, the cultural approach of an armed force. Lower down the chain of command, and in this sort of area here. So here at the top is the grand strategic, and then the chain of command below it. There will be influence exercised through the general tone and conduct of leaders, and of course through the detailed direction given by policy, and through the tone of specific orders to complete tasks. And then here at the coalface is where there is much more instinctive reaction, and those reactions will be conditioned by perceptions of the threat and the amount of freedom that is given to act. It's a considerable weight of evidence, as Geoffrey has already said, to indicate that the Israeli state considers itself to be constantly under a military threat. There have been many statements from political and military leaders that express that the defense of Israel is a matter of national survival, with threats from every neighbor, from hostile states with the capacity to fire missiles, from possible Iranian nuclear capability, and from global terrorism. There's also evidence to show that Israel doesn't believe that it has the capacity to defend in depth. These are circumstances where the defender can choose ground that's most suitable for defense, lure in an attacker, and then strike at ground of his own choosing, maneuvering to outflank and defeat. Now, there are some parallels here with the uncompromising policy of forward defense that West Germany adopted in the Cold War and which was approved by NATO, and dictated that the tactical plans of all the Allies were as far forward in West Germany as possible. And so it's understandable from a military perspective, while Israel's defensive posture appears to preempt and deter, since they can't afford to yield ground, and it may also lead to their objectives favouring the proactive seizure of land in order to provide a strong bargaining position, a strong early bargaining position. Contemporary statements that then superimpose on top of this the attitude at the top include Benjamin Netanyahu's address to the 2014 UN General Assembly, where he emphasized the threats to his country from anti-Semitism, militant Islam, Iranian nuclear power, and he highlights his responsibility as the Prime Minister of Israel in a very uncompromising tone that will clearly have had an impact on the attitudes of military leaders and the behavior of individual soldiers. Focusing on Gaza, it could be concluded that there's a deliberate policy to encourage the vilification of the Palestinians living there. The expansion of settlements such as Sderot, which is up here, right where my thing's wiggling now, very close to the border, and sustained by a new railway on which local residents can travel for free, shows that the government almost appears to be encouraging its people to live under the threat of rockets. They appear to recognize that the Hamas capability is very limited, their own countermeasures are very effective, and therefore the risk to the population is low. But the external message is very different. And it was highlighted during our investigation when we encountered what I would describe as a battlefield tour party of middle-aged residents, sort of silver surfers from Tel Aviv, who have been taken in an organized bus party to 3 kibbutz and told about what they called the war from a very partial perspective. Now, I also need to reflect on the Palestinian position. They are restricted, as you can see here, to a narrow strip of land that cannot sustain its population and relies entirely on life support through Israel. The flow of fuel, food, drugs, machinery are all regulated. Only 40% of electricity can be generated within the strip, and only a proportion of their food consumption grown. People are concentrated into small areas, and the population density in Gaza City is rated as the 5th highest population density in the world. There are constraints from the sea, as Geoffrey has mentioned. The fishing limit has been reduced incrementally and is now 3 miles. And the capacity to generate military capability is limited, although clearly motivation is very high. There are a number of armed groups, loosely referred to as Hamas, although they're not all controlled by a single chain of command. very difficult for me to put up a slide that shows the chain of command that I've just done for the Hamas. Their main offensive capabilities are these unsophisticated rockets, which have limited range and guidance systems, but of course they have a deadly capability. The threat they pose will impact on those living within range, although the evidence on the ground was not that it was materially significant. And I had time to go round the Israeli side of the border and look at the way life was conducted in order to make that judgment. The armed groups make limited incursions into Israel through tunnels on foot, and it's possible that this could result in kidnap, small arms attacks, or suicide bombs. To defend Gaza, the principal weapons in use are small arms and mines or IEDs. There are rudimentary and very fluid command and control systems. The recent operation in Gaza has to be considered in its historical context as much as the threat that it poses. Territory occupied after the 1967 war, as Geoffrey has said, is largely a home for refugees displaced from other parts of the Holy Land. And since 2005, Israel's approach to security has been entirely based on containment rather than internal security. But it still bears the responsibilities of an occupying power, controls all the borders bar one, and, as I've said, all the resources entering the area. Perceptions within Israel are that Hamas is not just resisting this siege, but also retains the objective of the destruction of Israel. The Israeli Defense Force is a standing force designed to protect the Israeli state, which, as I've said, considers itself to be under constant threat. It is the 6th highest global military spender and has a standing force of 176,500. And it has 445,000 reserve personnel. It has the 2nd highest spending per capita after the US. It depends on reserves to conduct its operations, and so this means there's got to be some planning time for any major engagement. Its mission is to defend the existence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Israel, to protect the inhabitants of Israel, and to combat all forms of terrorism which threaten daily life. The overarching ethics of the IDF are consistent with the requirements of any military force, although there is an emphasis on the defense of the state and the tradition of the Jewish people. Their main doctrine, as it's called, highlights, among other things, the fact that Israel cannot afford to lose a single war, has to be defensive at the strategic level, has no territorial ambitions. In combat, there is a need to prevent escalation and to determine the outcome of war quickly and decisively with a very low casualty ratio. It stipulates that a small standing armed force will provide early warning and prepare for defense supported by an efficient mobilization system, which can then move to counterattack. And the attack will transfer the battle to the enemy's territory and the quick attainment of war objectives. Now, there are some anomalies here which I will highlight further. I'm now going to turn to a more detailed examination of Operation Protective Edge from an operational and tactical perspective. So I've dealt with the strategic, and I now come down in my chart to the bit in the middle and the bottom. Starting with the enemy, there is no credible tactical territorial military threat to Israel from Gaza. Armed groups are restricted to the use of rockets that are manufactured within the Strip or possibly smuggled through tunnels, and the use of lightly armed infantry who will have the capacity for limited infiltration. They're largely contained by border and movement control, although Hamas has constructed military tunnels to enable communications and conduct raids. At the highest level, the IDF military posture is based on the perception of an existential threat. The Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force stated on the 3rd of October 2014, after this, "We are not in Milan here. We may be in the OECD, but we are in the heart of the Middle East, completely surrounded by enemies. The only thing standing between us and ISIS right now is that they are currently busy with more urgent matters." The IDF has the advantage of the defender. The rocket threat has triggered extensive defensive measures, including the requirement for shelters in public and residential buildings, filtration for chemical attack. Its Iron Dome system is an effective anti-missile defense system. So the impact of the rockets is largely psychological. Hamas and other fighters are hard to distinguish from the civilian population, in part because they're going to choose to camouflage, to use this as camouflage, but in part because the area is so densely populated that it's impossible to delineate what I would refer to as a combat zone. The normal distinction between the rear area, where civilian support functions take place in relative safety, is not evident in Gaza. The whole area is a battle zone. And in these circumstances, where there is so little tactical depth, it is almost impossible for Hamas not to use civilians as a shield. The size of Hamas's military capability is therefore very difficult to determine, but it may amount to around 10,000 fighters. In the case of Operation Protective Edge, my assessment is that the plan was executed in 4 broad stages. I've put the principal activities here. The first stage was preparations from April to July. During this period, a detailed plan will have been developed. In my view, it was not a spontaneous reaction to a single incident. In order to generate the required capability, some of the units involved had to be mobilized from other parts of Israel, and this required political direction. In the UK, this would have been a very key milestone, since the decision to call up reserves has such a critical impact both politically and militarily. Existing contingency plans will have shortened the planning process, but activities such as intelligence preparation of the battlefield, the pre-positioning of resources, and the call-up and integration of reserves will have taken some time, although the IDF is extremely efficient at integrating its reserves into its fighting force. The planning appears to have reached its crescendo in late June, when there was an increase in Hamas rocket attacks, and this may have either been an indicator or a provocation, and it's very difficult to judge which. In my language, phase 1 of the operation was the air operation, which began on the 7th of July. Normal military practice for this phase to be designed to destroy command and control in depth and any other targets that could be preempted. The capture of Hossam Kawasemi on the 11th of July was directly linked to the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teenagers on the 12th of June, and was probably a special forces operation deliberately synchronized into this phase. At the start time, the H-hour for the land engagement, there will have been an increasing concentration on the areas where ground troops were to attack, so more air and artillery attacks in certain areas. And it's very unlikely that ceasefire negotiations at this stage were credible, since the operational objectives required a land incursion to destroy the tunnels, dominate terrain, and intimidate any aggressors, and provide the bargaining position for further political action. So phase 2 of the operation was the main land attack, which took place from the 17th of July to the 10th of August, with withdrawals starting on the 3rd of August. Here, the main objectives are likely to have been achieved by the 3rd of August, and this will have included the destruction of the tunnels and also sufficient offensive action to overpower the opposition. But the intensity of fighting does seem to have increased around the 1st of August, and I'll return to that in a moment. Consolidation would have been in phase 3 and will have taken place from the 10th of August to the 26th of August. There does seem to have been a significant Hamas rocket and mortar bombardment from the 22nd to the 26th of August, although there's some conflicting reports about this, but they don't appear to have provoked commensurate retaliation by the Israeli Defense Force, which suggests to me that their objectives had been achieved. Opinion polls show that Israeli government approval was far higher at the beginning of the operation than at the end, which is no surprise, and on the 26th of August, an open-ended ceasefire was declared. Now, I made this sketch of the ground attack, and just to look at it briefly in a little bit more detail, I believe there were 3 phases here, and in the sort of pucy, lighty green bit at the top is phase 1, which started on the 17th of July and rose to its maximum intensity between the 20th and the 23rd of July. There were 4 axes represented by those arrows, largely in the north and centre of the strip. The second phase, which started on the 26th of July, is the bit in the middle, 7 Armour Brigade, and concentrated in the middle and towards the south. And then the third phase, which appears to have started on the 1st of August, involved some very intense fighting in the south. And then the ground forces began their withdrawal on the 3rd of August, leaving a strip of significant destruction behind them. And I suppose this is possibly the protective edge in the operation's title. Now, there are 4 particular aspects of the IDF tactics that I've considered. First of all, the Hannibal Protocol. This is a drill for the reaction to a kidnapped or captured soldier and may have been activated twice during this operation. In particular, on the 1st of August by the Givati Brigade Commander Colonel Winter in the Rafah area, where there are reports of the disproportionate use of force. It appears that the authority for the execution of Hannibal was given by the CGS, so right up the top of the chain of command. Having a code word that is designed to ensure instant reaction and establish an immediate priority for resources is entirely logical from a military perspective. It's very similar to a thing we used to do in Northern Ireland called rat trap. And it's assumed that Hannibal is called because an IDF kidnapping is suspected and there is a need to concentrate force in order to recover the individual. What is more difficult to understand is that the response requires the sanction of the CGS, and the level of force required appears to result in a dramatic increase in fire, including indirect artillery fire in depth. If the aim was to recover the captive, then there might well be a need to cut off the enemy escape routes, and this might be done by fire. But it is more likely that offensive action to retake the ground where the incident occurred would be a priority. And this would require the rapid deployment forward of boots on the ground. But it does seem as if time is sacrificed in order to seek authority from the very highest level to apply a huge weight of fire on the target area with a high likelihood that both captives and captors will be killed. Secondly, the Dahir tactics. These are the systematic and deliberate application of disproportionate force, including civilian suffering, to deter and alienate the fighters from the population. It is also designed in ground combat to minimize the risk to the IDF. Now, providing effective covering fire is a necessary requirement when ground troops are maneuvering. Ideally, this will be precisely aimed at the enemy, but particularly in a built-up area, it is very hard to pinpoint enemy fighting positions. And it's therefore entirely acceptable military practice to keep the enemy's heads down with very heavy direct and indirect covering fire. It would be normal for a ground commander to be given orders for opening fire and rules of engagement that restrict the ability to risk large civilian casualties. And in an area like Suraya, it is almost inevitable that the use of tank, mortar and 155mm artillery fire will cause civilian casualties. Given the size and population density in Gaza, operations such as Protective Edge will cause civilian suffering and intimidation. However, it is highly unlikely that this will alienate the civilian from the fighter. Indeed, in an environment where there can be no escape, it is likely to drive the uninvolved closer to those who are resisting. And these tactics are likely to make resistance stronger. My third area of tactics is the term called mowing the grass, which is used by the IDF to imply that every so often there will be a need to attack an area in order to continue to dominate it, reduce enemy capacity, and deter further action. It also assumes that over time the enemy military capability will be refreshed and further attacks will always be necessary. Now, this is different in other military forces where, particularly in counterinsurgency, withdrawal from an area allows the terrorist back to influence the civilian population. And interestingly, in the context of our operations in Afghanistan, mowing the grass was considered to represent tactical failure, since offensive operations have to be followed up with development and capacity building in order to secure the society that you're trying to dominate or help. And finally, and Geoffrey has talked enough about this, but the knock on the roof. At first sight, this appears to be a very sensible use of precision munitions, but I find it very difficult to make sense that you warn the occupants of a house that it's to be attacked and allow them to escape, unless it's known that they're innocent and that the target is hiding military capability. Since Hamas command and control mechanisms are not dependent on infrastructure, it can only be assumed that this tactic is designed to intimidate by the destruction of specified residential buildings. So to conclude, I would like to draw three general areas of conclusion. My first is to go back to the link between the tactical, strategic, and operational. It's extremely hard to judge where decisions were made without more detail of the planning, orders, and assessment process. But it does seem likely that Operation Protective Edge was a deliberate plan that was constructed over a number of months and weeks and was therefore cleared at the very highest level of government. The overall scheme of manoeuvre will have had to have been understood and authorised at the very highest level. There's evidence to show that targeting decisions were made at this level, and it's extremely difficult to conclude how much was actually delegated from senior commanders, particularly into the area in the middle that I referred to as the operational level. I would also assume that political decisions were required at key stages in the campaign. From my experience, the start of the air bombardment on the 7th of July, the ceasefire negotiations from the 14th to the 17th of July, the ordering of the ground invasion on the 17th of July, discussions over the humanitarian ceasefire on the 26th of July, and the ordering of withdrawal on the 3rd of August. And it does seem to me that in this case, the distinction between strategic, operational, and tactical decisions is very blurred. My second conclusion revolves around the seizing of ground. The ground incursions seized certain defined areas which may well have had tunnels in them or rocket stores, but they were almost certainly not the only areas in Gaza to have defensive construction. It is difficult to see why these areas were chosen other than to have an impact on the population, and that is the view of Gaza City from over on the Israeli side. It was presumably to provide a bargaining chip for ceasefire negotiations and to destroy industrial and agricultural capability in furtherance of the mowing the grass policy. Ground was not taken to provide a tactical military advantage, but it seems to have been to intimidate and to allow the best possible bargaining position with the time and resources available. And then finally, the management of refugees. Normally, it would be expected that there would be a plan for the management of refugees, since innocent civilians will always be displaced by fighting. In the case of Gaza, since there is no escape route for refugees, it should be anticipated that there are declared safe areas for civilians. But there's no evidence of such a plan from what I've seen in the IDF Tactics. In fact, attacks on the UN school and the knock on the roof gave me the appearance of a deliberate attempt to demonstrate that nowhere is safe. Geoffrey.
Thanks. With a little history and some law and the all-important military view, how else should you approach the question of may war crimes have been committed? You can see the immense value of the military contribution already. And I should say that in the same way as the Israeli Defense Forces in Israel itself did not cooperate with either the Goldstone report or the Mary Davis report, we wrote them specific questions and we received an acknowledgement, but no reply. Well, there is one other category of very obvious evidence which relates to what Nick was saying about, as it were, the people at the top level of command, the politicians, the people who create the political environment, the social environment in which all these things can happen. And for that we turned to Dr. Nevenka Tromp, who with her team searched out examples of what was said, because what is said may reflect what's actually in the mind of the people who allow things to be said or who say them, or who operate within a culture where these things are said and tolerated. And there's Dr. Nevenka Tromp, and she looked for things said before, during, and after the conflict as indicative of what may have been within the minds of those controlling Operation Protective Edge, because if you can dehumanize the enemy, you make it easier for decisions that would be unlawful and be bound to cause civilian injury and death to be put into effect by others. As a starter, she found that General Eland, the former head of Israel's National Security Council, saying that there was no such thing as innocent civilians in Gaza. And he likened civilians to the electorate in Nazi Germany for bringing Hitler to power and saying that they were effectively entitled to what they got. And the general statements that she found, and I'll just give you a few samples because this is a lecture in how to do things not leading to a specific conclusion necessarily. She found examples of attitudes hostile to the Arabs as a race, Muslims as a religious group, and Palestinians as an ethnic group. Let me give you some examples of what she found in the business that may have been the business of creating an us culture and a them culture. It's what's called hate speech or dehumanization process. A long time ago, not a long time ago, but in 2002, Moshe Ya'alon made headlines when, on appointment as the IDF Chief of Staff, he stated that the Palestinians are a cancer. The late Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, spiritual leader of the Israelis' ultra-Orthodox Shas party, who called in 2001 in a sermon for the annihilation of Arabs, saying it's forbidden to be merciful to them. Later on, he said, how can you... I beg your pardon, no, that was Ovadia Yosef. It's forbidden to be merciful to them. You must send missiles to them and annihilate them. He also said, the Lord shall return the Arabs' deeds on their own heads, waste their seed, and exterminate them. Now, it doesn't matter what individuals say. It's whether what they say is tolerated, encouraged, or permitted, or outlawed and sanctioned. These things were tolerated. Rabbi Yosef also said, and you can see this, how can you make peace with a snake? Those evildoers, the Arabs, it says in the Talmud that God is sorry he ever created those sons of Ishmael. They're stupid. Their religion is as ugly as them. This sort of material, it's not determinative, but it is material. It helps us understand whether the question marks that General Parker raises and that Professor Schlein raises and that I raise, whether they're question marks that would be things that a court of law investigating war crimes would want to look at much more closely. Moshe Ya'alon, the Minister of Defense, said as long as 3-year-old children are educated to carry explosive belts at ceremonies and Israel doesn't appear on their maps, there's no chance for peace. How helpful is that? Then Colonel Winter, to whom General Parker referred, in his letter to his troops on the eve of Protective Edge, said, history has chosen us to be the sharp edge of the bayonet of fighting, the terrorist enemy from Gaza, which curses, defames, and so on and so forth. Then I turn my eyes to the sky and call with you, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord God, the Lord of Israel, make our path successful. We're about to fight for your people, Israel, against an enemy who defames your name. Would that help you if you were looking at this man, his motivation, and what he actually did? I express no view. I invite you to say it may help you. Ayelet Shaked, a member of the Knesset for the Jewish Home Party in 2014, just one day before Protective Edge, posted on a Facebook page, they have to die there, houses should be demolished so they can't bear any more terrorists. Behind every terrorist stand dozens of men and women and so on. Time is short. You'll see some more in the printed material, but the minister, Naftali Bennett, said, I think it's terrible. This is after it was all over that Hamas is butchering his own children. I would never take my children and place them next to the rocket launcher. They're taking children and placing them next to missile launchers and shooting at missiles at Israel. The deputy minister said, amongst other things, mixed marriages are a silent Holocaust. There's lots of material. And before I end for the break, let me say this at once. Of course, the Hamas perspective, we were asked to look at the position of Israel and how to approach the question of whether they may have committed war crimes. But of course, you've got to look at it the other side as well, the Hamas perspective. And in a sense, the question to be asked of them, as Mary Davis says, I think in her report, and certainly Goldston said in his opinion when he was dealing with Operation Cast Lead, maybe the question is simpler because they are firing rockets that can't be accurately targeted with limited prospects of getting through an impregnable or nearly impregnable Israeli defense system. So the question would be for them, if they were ever brought to trial, something along the lines of whether these rockets and whether their tunnels could be used for incursions into Israel were necessary in defense of their own state, where their own access to sophisticated weaponry was extremely limited, and where they had to do something, and where they had to do this in defense of themselves. That's the sort of issue that would be tested. But it would be tested against the same law that would be applied so far as Israel is concerned. As with Israel and the Israel government, Dr. Tromp looked for public statements from Hamas, as opposed to Fatah, from Hamas. There's a great deal of material from Hamas showing that they wanted to and did treat Israel and the Israeli Defense Force as an enemy, but it's very hard to find, or it's much harder to find from Hamas, statements of the dehumanizing type that we may have seen something of in the earlier examples. Some tentative conclusions, nothing very substantial, but some tentative conclusions nevertheless. General Parker's diagram shows us how command at every level has to be dealt with separately, or not separately, but it has to be modulated by application of the law. And that brings us to the question whether, if you have a two-sided fight, should both sides of the argument, both sides of the fight, also be modulated by the law? Well, of course they should be. But is that our experience? Are there wars where both sides actually apply the law? I don't know if he remembers this, but I asked General Parker that, and he reluctantly agreed that it was possible that World War II, Korea and Cyprus may have been examples of both sides applying the law or trying to do so in major conflicts, whereas you couldn't say that of Vietnam, Northern Ireland, Iraq or Bosnia. And what does that say about the effectiveness of the law of war in control of the way people behave in war? International laws imposed generally will not be followed by either party in this conflict or in other similar conflicts if both parties' fears are genuine, and if not only genuinely but apparently well-founded. They will find reasons not to follow the law, not to make the balance between the concrete military objective and the unacceptable or disproportionate level of civilian suffering. And so, if you contemplate a trial which could yet come about at the International Criminal Court in light of the referral of the matter to that court, at such a trial, both parties would be able to argue. Hamas, for example, would be able to argue that as an imprisoned state or entity, it must be allowed to fire rockets that are not capable of being accurately targeted, regardless of the black and white letter of the law, because there's no other way to defend and advance its interests. Israel might argue, as General Parker has already said, that the black and white letter of the law can't apply to them because of the level of risk, which is so great, atomic fire coming from somewhere, surrounded by enemies. And I think that's really where I'd like to end it before we come to questions, and with this really very general consideration. Are we living in a world where the reality is that there are conflicts where neither side really has any intention of following the law. Not really. And if so, what does that tell us? And it tells us, I said right at the beginning, that the rule of law doesn't always apply. And do you remember I mentioned how in the build-up to all this you had, apparently, according to that cache of papers, American intervention trying to cause problems between Fatah and Hamas, driving them apart at a time when it might have been that a negotiated settlement would have been possible. Supposing that's part of an overall plan to serve the interests of one side of a conflict which does not intend to follow the law. What does that say about the involvement of other countries? What do we know about the involvement of other countries and commercial enterprises who may support one side or another of a conflict that is, in fact, not going to follow the law? We know of a company in Holland, for example, that has been sanctioned or indeed stopped its business because it was supporting, I think it was the creation of the unlawful wall in Israel, or maybe building the settlements, I'm not sure. Are we now going to be dependent not on parties to conflicts obeying the law, because they won't, but on other mechanisms? Or must we be realistic and say, there are some conflicts, the law won't apply, let them get on with it until one side wins? Horrible, long-term utilitarian greater peace may result from just yielding to one side, winning the battle, and never following the law. But these and other questions you can develop. We'll take 5 minutes now. I'll ask the panel to join me behind the table. We'll take your written questions and we'll get through as many as we can by 8 o'clock. Thank you very much.